Imagine a continent in upheaval, where faith and the sword intertwined in a deadly dance. Think of 12th century Europe, a mosaic of feudal kingdoms, imposing castles, and vast forests, where life was shaped by the church, by war, and by the land. It was not an era of unified empires, but of feudal lords, knights, and peasants, each caught in their own hierarchy of duty and loyalty. Yet above all divisions loomed a unifying force that at times was more powerful than any king, the Christian faith. And it was this faith that ignited a flame that would sweep across the continent, dragging kings and commoners to distant lands in the name of God. Medieval Europe was a world of stark contrasts. On one hand, the brutality of war, the poverty of most of the population, and the harsh reality of rural life. On the other, the rise of great cathedrals, the flourishing of monastic orders, and the pursuit of a spiritual life that promised eternal salvation. Chivalry, with its ideals of honor, bravery, and loyalty, began to solidify as a code of conduct, though often in conflict with the bloody reality of battlefields. Society was rigidly stratified, with the clergy, nobility, and peasants playing defined roles, each contributing to the divine and earthly order. In this complex scenario, the Catholic Church wielded immense power, not only spiritual, but also political. The Pope was a figure of unquestionable authority, capable of moving kings and armies with a single decree. And it was religious fervor, fueled by papal preaching, that gave rise to one of history's most extraordinary and violent movements, the Crusades. The idea of liberating the Holy Land from the hands of the Muslims, of pilgrimaging to Jerusalem, and of fighting in the name of Christ inflamed the hearts of thousands, transforming knights into crusaders and kingdoms into platforms of holy war. To understand the figure of Richard the Lionheart, it is essential to place him within the vast and complex domain of his family, the Angevin Empire. This was not an empire in the traditional sense of a contiguous territory under a single crown, but a vast and heterogeneous collection of lands and titles that stretched across much of Western Europe. In the 12th century, the Angevin Empire was the greatest power in Europe, rivaled only by the Holy Roman Empire in influence. His father, Henry II of England, was the architect of this empire. As Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, Count of Anjou, and King of England, Henry controlled vast territories stretching from the Pyrenees in southern France to Scotland. This vast expanse of lands, though under the rule of a single king, was a complex web of feudal loyalties, where each duke, count, and baron had their own rights and ambitions. The language of the court was French, and the culture predominantly Anglo-Norman and French. England, though the principal crown, was only one part of this transnational empire. The French possessions, especially the rich and strategic Aquitaine, inherited through Henry's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, were the true economic and cultural heart of the Angevin domain. This vastness of lands, however, was a constant source of conflict. Borders were fluid, loyalties volatile, and rivalry with the French crown, which saw Angevin power as a direct threat to its own sovereignty, was a constant. Life at the Angevin court was one of constant movement, with the king and his family traveling between their various domains to assert their authority. It was an environment of political intrigue, rampant ambition, and feudal wars, where the king's sons, including Richard, would be raised to fight and govern. The Angevin Empire was a colossus, but a colossus with feet of clay, whose internal divisions and external pressure threatened its cohesion. It was in this scenario of vast power and constant intrigues that on September 8, 1157, at Beaumont Palace, Oxford, England, Richard was born. He was the third legitimate son of King Henry II of England and the legendary Eleanor of Aquitaine. His birth,
though not shrouded in divine legends like those of other great leaders, was that of a prince from one of Europe's most powerful families, destined for a life of privilege but also of constant challenges. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was an extraordinary figure in her own right. Queen of France, before becoming Queen of England, she was a woman of immense intelligence, culture, and political influence. Her court in Aquitaine was a center for troubadours and chivalric culture, and her presence would profoundly shape Richard's personality and interests. He inherited from her not only beauty and charisma, but also a love for poetry, music, and Provençal culture.
Richard grew up in an environment of constant movement, traveling between his father's various domains in England and France. He was educated in the arts of war, diplomacy, and governance, as was expected of a prince of his stature. He learned to ride, use the sword and bow, and lead men in battle. His childhood was marked by the presence of his brothers, especially the elder, Henry, the young king, and the younger, John, who would become his rivals and at times his enemies. From an early age, Richard demonstrated a strong and impetuous personality. He was a man of intense passions, both in love and in war. His courage and military skill were evident, and he quickly stood out among his brothers as the most promising in terms of military leadership. His destiny, however, would not be that of a peaceful king. Europe was about to be swept by a new wave of religious fervor, and Richard, with his warlike nature and unwavering faith, was destined to become Christendom's greatest champion. His name, one day, would echo across the battlefields of the Holy Land as that of a true lion. While Richard grew and forged himself as a warrior, the Christian world was shaken by devastating news from the East. In 1187, Jerusalem, the holy city, had fallen, not to just any enemy, but to the legendary Muslim Sultan Saladin, a military and political leader of unquestionable genius. The loss of Jerusalem, a sacred site for Christians, Jews, and Muslims, was a seismic shock to Europe. The city, which had been conquered by the Crusaders in the First Crusade, 1099, was now once again under Muslim control. The fall of Jerusalem ignited an unprecedented religious fervor across Europe. Pope Gregory VIII issued the papal bull Audita Tremendi, calling for a new crusade to retake the Holy City. The call for holy war resonated throughout all Christian kingdoms, from England and France to the Holy Roman Empire. Kings, nobles, knights, and commoners all were summoned to take up the cross and fight in the name of Christ. The promise was of full indulgence for sins and a place in paradise for those who died in combat. This was the Third Crusade, and it would attract Europe's greatest monarchs: Frederick Barbarossa, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire; Philip II Augustus, the King of France; and of course, Richard, who was still Duke of Aquitaine and not King of England. The idea of a holy war, of an armed pilgrimage to liberate sacred sites, was deeply rooted in the medieval mindset. It was a mixture of faith, adventure, ambition, and the pursuit of glory and salvation. For Richard, the call to the crusade was not just a religious duty, it was an opportunity to prove his worth as a warrior, to seek glory in battle, and to fulfill a destiny that seemed to have been laid out for him. He was a man of war by nature, and the crusade offered the perfect stage for his skills and ambition. His life was about to intertwine with the fate of the Holy Land, and his name would become synonymous with bravery and a lion's heart. The childhood of Richard, the future Lionheart, was a period of privilege and an education that would prepare him for a life of war and governance. Born into Angevine royalty, he was raised not in England,
but predominantly in Aquitaine, his mother Eleanor's vast and wealthy duchy. This Aquitanian heritage would profoundly shape his personality, culture, and passions. Aquitaine was a vibrant center of Provençal culture, troubadour poetry, and chivalric ideals, an environment that Richard absorbed with enthusiasm. His formal education, like that of any prince of his era, focused on the arts of war and governance. He was trained from an early age in handling the sword, bow, and lance, becoming a formidable knight. Horsemanship was an essential skill, and Richard would excel as a master of cavalry, capable of leading devastating charges. He learned military tactics, the art of siege, and the logistics of campaigns, skills that would make him one of the greatest commanders of his time. But Richard's education went beyond the battlefield. He was fluent in French, his native tongue, Latin, and possibly some English. His passion for poetry and music, inherited from his mother, was notable. He himself was a talented troubadour, composing verses in Occitan, the language of Aquitaine. This artistic sensibility, combined with his ferocity in battle, created a complex and multifaceted figure. He was a warrior, but also a man of culture, a leader who could inspire both through force and art.
Life at the Angevine court was one of constant movement and observation. Richard witnessed firsthand the political intrigues, alliances, and betrayals that permeated the relationship between his father, Henry II, and the King of France, Philip II Augustus. He learned to navigate this dangerous environment, to forge alliances, and to distrust his rivals. This childhood, rich in experiences and challenges, forged in Richard not only a warrior, but a leader with a strong, impetuous personality and an insatiable thirst for glory and recognition. Richard's relationship with his father, Henry II, was a complex tapestry of love, respect, rivalry, and, ultimately, rebellion. Henry II, a powerful and astute king, was known for his ability to govern and for his distrust of anyone who might challenge his authority, including his own sons. He had promised Richard the Duchy of Aquitaine, but was reluctant to grant him full control over its lands and resources, fearing his sons would use that power against him. This reluctance of Henry to delegate power and to secure his sons their own domains was the seed of discord. Richard, with his impetuous nature and ambition to govern, felt frustrated and underestimated. He wanted his own kingdom, his own glory, and not just to be a vassal to his father. This tension was exacerbated by the influence of his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who, after years of conflict with Henry II, often encouraged her sons to rebel against their father. Eleanor, herself a powerful and independent queen, saw in Richard the son who could challenge Henry's dominance and restore the glory of her own lineage. The conflict between father and son was not just a matter of power, it was also a matter of personality. Henry was a cold and calculating strategist, while Richard was a man of intense passions, more prone to acting on impulse and for personal glory. This difference in temperament led to constant friction and disagreements. Henry saw Richard's impetuosity as a threat to the stability of his empire, while Richard saw his father's caution as a restriction on his own ambition. Rivalry with his brothers, especially with Henry the young king, the apparent heir, and with John, Henry II's favorite, also fueled the conflict. Each brother sought the father's favor and possession of lands, creating a complex web of alliances and betrayals within the royal family itself. The seed of rebellion was planted, and Europe was about to witness one of the most dramatic and bloody family sagas in medieval history. The latent tension between Henry II and his sons exploded into a series of rebellions that would tear the Angevin Empire apart for decades. The first major revolt occurred in 1173, when Henry, the young king, tired of being a king without real power, rebelled against his father, with the support of King Louis VII of France, his father-in-law, and many discontented nobles.
Richard, then only 16 and already Duke of Aquitaine, joined his brother in the rebellion, driven by his own ambition and the influence of his mother, Eleanor, who actively encouraged the revolt. This rebellion was not an isolated event, it was a full-scale civil war that involved much of the Angevin Empire. Henry II's sons, Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, united against their father, supported by their French allies and by nobles who saw in the revolt an opportunity to weaken royal power. The fighting was fierce, with castles besieged and armies on the move throughout France and England. Henry II, a shrewd and experienced general, managed to crush the rebellion, but not without great difficulty. Despite the defeat, the sons' rebellions would continue to haunt Henry II's reign. Richard, in particular, continued to defy his father, often allying himself with the King of France, Philip II Augustus, the new French monarch and a relentless enemy of Henry II. The rivalry between Richard and his father was a constant, punctuated by fragile truces and new outbreaks of violence. Richard was a formidable warrior, and his military skill made him a real threat to his father's power. The death of Henry, the young king, in 1183 and Geoffrey in 1186 did not bring peace. On the contrary, it intensified the rivalry between Richard and his father and between Richard and his younger brother John. Henry II, in his final years, found himself in a desperate position, fighting against his own sons and against the King of France. The sons' rebellion was a testament to the ambition and ferocity of the Angevin family, a saga of betrayal and war that would shape Richard's character and prepare him for the even greater challenges that awaited him.
The saga of family conflicts that marked Henry II's reign came to an end in 1189. Exhausted by his son's constant rebellions and the relentless pressure from King Philip II Augustus of France, Henry II, the powerful architect of the Angevin Empire, was at the end of his strength. His health was debilitated and his will broken. In his last days, Henry II faced the ultimate humiliation. Richard, now the apparent heir, had once again allied himself with Philip II Augustus and launched a final campaign against his father. In a decisive confrontation, Henry II was defeated. Forced to accept a humiliating peace treaty, he discovered that his favorite son, John, had also betrayed him, joining Richard. This last betrayal was the fatal blow for Henry II. On July 6, 1189, Henry II died in Chinon, France, a king who had ruled a vast empire, but who died embittered and betrayed by his own sons. His death marked the end of an era and the beginning of another. Richard, the rebellious son who had fought against his father for years, was now the King of England, Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, and Count of Anjou. The throne he so coveted was finally within his reach. Richard's succession to the throne was a moment of transition. He, the man who had spent much of his life in rebellion, was now the sovereign of one of Europe's greatest empires. His ascent was marked by a sense of relief and expectation. Europe awaited to see how the impetuous and charismatic Duke of Aquitaine would behave as king. His coronation, which would soon take place, would be an event of great pomp and symbolism, marking the beginning of a reign that would be defined by war, faith, and the pursuit of glory in distant lands. On September 3, 1189, at Westminster Abbey, London, Richard was crowned King of England. The ceremony was a spectacle of pomp and symbolism, an event that marked the ascent of one of the most legendary monarchs in medieval history. The coronation was a moment of reconciliation for the royal family. John, the brother who had betrayed him, was forgiven and received lands and titles, though Richard maintained a cautious watch over him.
Richard's coronation was not just a formal event, it was the recognition of his authority and his destiny. He was now the leader of a vast empire, and his responsibilities were immense. However, his mind was already turned towards the east. The call for the Third Crusade, which had been issued after the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin, was his main priority. Richard, the warrior by nature, saw in the crusade the opportunity to fulfill a religious duty, to seek glory in battle, and to consolidate his reputation as Christendom's greatest knight. He did not hesitate to take drastic measures to finance the crusade. He sold lands, titles, and offices, emptying the royal treasury to raise the necessary funds for the expedition. His priority was not to govern England, but to lead the Holy War. He viewed England as a source of resources and men for the crusade, and not as the center of his interest. This attitude, although pragmatic for his objectives, would generate resentment among some of his subjects and nobles. His coronation marked the beginning of a reign that would be brief in terms of time spent in England, but immortal in terms of impact and legend. Richard the Lionheart, the warrior king, was ready to embark on his greatest adventure, a journey that would take him to distant lands to confront the greatest Muslim leader of his time, and to forge a legacy that would echo for centuries. Europe was about to witness the fury and bravery of a true lion on the battlefield. With the crown of England firmly on his head, Richard the Lionheart's mind was singularly focused on his great objective, the Third Crusade. He was not a king content to rule from his palace. He was a warrior, and the call to holy war in Jerusalem was a call he could not ignore. His journey to the Holy Land would not be a simple relocation, but an epic odyssey, full of challenges, fragile alliances, and demonstrations of his relentless determination. Before departing, Richard took drastic measures to finance the crusade. He sold everything he could: crown lands, titles, offices, and even the right to govern cities. His famous phrase, "I would sell London if I could find a buyer," demonstrated his absolute priority. He was willing to empty the royal treasury and alienate some of his subjects and nobles to raise the vast funds needed to equip and sustain a crusader army. This decision, though pragmatic for his objectives, revealed his view of England as a source of resources for his military ambitions, and not as the center of his interest as a ruler.
Richard's journey to the Holy Land began in 1190. He did not follow the dangerous and exhausting overland route that had decimated previous crusaders. Instead, he chose the sea route, a more efficient strategy, but still fraught with perils. His fleet, one of the largest and best equipped of the time, sailed across the Mediterranean, making strategic stops and facing unexpected challenges. One of the first significant stops was in Sicily. There, Richard became entangled in complex disputes with King Tancred of Sicily, who had imprisoned his sister Joanna, widow of King William II of Sicily, and withheld her inheritance. Richard, with his characteristic impetuosity, did not hesitate to use force to resolve the issue, taking Messina and forcing Tancred to yield to his demands. This show of force, though effective, revealed to other Crusader leaders like Philip II Augustus of France that Richard was a formidable ally, but also a dangerous and unpredictable rival. The journey continued with an unexpected detour to Cyprus. Richard's fleet was hit by a storm, and some of his ships, including one carrying his sister Joanna and his fiancée Berengaria of Navarre, were forced to land in Cyprus. The ruler of Cyprus, Isaac Comnenus, a local tyrant, imprisoned the survivors and confiscated their goods. Richard, in a fit of rage, invaded Cyprus, defeated Isaac Comnenus, and conquered the island in a few weeks. This conquest was not merely retribution, it was a brilliant strategic move. Cyprus would become a vital base for the Crusaders in the Holy Land, providing supplies and a safe harbor, and Richard would later sell it to the Knights Templar. Richard's journey to the Holy Land was therefore a series of conquests and displays of power, a prelude to the confrontations that awaited him in the Levant. Richard the Lionheart's arrival in the Holy Land in June 1191 was a moment of immense hope and renewal for the exhausted Crusaders. He landed at Acre, a crucial port city that had been under siege by the Crusaders for almost 2 years, but which stubbornly resisted under Muslim control. The siege of Acre had turned into a bloody stalemate, a battle of attrition that consumed lives and resources with no end in sight.
Richard's presence, with his vast fleet,
well-equipped men and treasure, injected new life into the crusade. He was the missing force. His arrival was in stark contrast to that of Philip II Augustus of France, who had arrived months earlier but seemed less committed to leading the assault. Richard, with his energy and tactical genius, quickly took command of the siege operations. He brought with him engineers and advanced siege engines, and his presence inspired the Crusaders to redouble their efforts. The siege of Acre was a hell on earth. The city was heavily fortified, and the Muslim garrison, under Saladin's command, resisted bravely. The Crusaders, in turn, were exhausted, suffering from disease, hunger, and constant attacks from Saladin's forces surrounding the siege. The air was heavy with the smell of death, smoke, and decomposition. Each day, more lives were lost, and morale was at its lowest point. Richard, despite his own illness, he suffered from a fever that prevented him from fighting personally for a time, oversaw the siege from his tent, ordering the construction of siege engines and the launching of projectiles against the city walls. He was relentless in his determination to take Acre. His presence on the field, even when ill, inspired his men to fight with renewed ferocity. Finally, after weeks of brutal assaults and incessant bombardments, Acre's walls yielded. On July 12, 1191, the city surrendered to the Crusaders. The victory at Acre was a monumental triumph, a relief for the Crusaders and a devastating blow to Saladin. However, the victory was stained by an act of brutality that would shock even the standards of the time. Richard, impatient with the delay in payment of the ransom for the Muslim prisoners and suspecting betrayal by Saladin, ordered the massacre of approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners outside the walls of Acre. This act, though justified by Richard as a military necessity, would be a stain on his legacy and a testament to the cruelty of holy war. With the fall of Acre, Richard the Lionheart emerged as the undisputed leader of the Third Crusade. However, his leadership was not without challenges. He had to navigate a minefield of political rivalries, personal ambitions, and fragile loyalties among the different Crusader leaders.
His main rival was Philip II Augustus, the King of France. Philip had arrived in Acre months before Richard, but his participation in the siege was less active. He viewed Richard's power and popularity with envy and resentment. The rivalry between the two kings, which already existed in Europe, intensified in the Holy Land. Philip, citing illness and the need to protect his own domains in France, left the crusade soon after the fall of Acre, an act that was seen as a betrayal by many crusaders and left Richard as the sole European monarch to lead the expedition. Besides Philip, Richard had to deal with other leaders, such as Leopold V, Duke of Austria, who also resented Richard's arrogance and authority. The disagreement between Richard and Leopold, which would culminate in Richard's imprisonment upon his return to Europe, had its roots in the power and prestige disputes in the Holy Land. Despite these rivalries, Richard demonstrated remarkable leadership. He was a charismatic commander, capable of inspiring his men with his bravery and his presence on the battlefield. He was a brilliant strategist, capable of planning and executing complex campaigns against a formidable enemy like Saladin. His priority was personal glory and the reconquest of Jerusalem, and he did not hesitate to make unpopular or brutal decisions to achieve his objectives. Richard's leadership in the crusade was a testament to his willpower and his determination. He was a warrior king in his essence, and the Holy Land was the perfect stage for his display of bravery and military skill. He did not seek peace, but victory, and was willing to pay the price in blood and suffering to achieve it. After the Truce of Jaffa, which ended the Third Crusade without the reconquest of Jerusalem, Richard the Lionheart was ready to return to Europe. His mission in the Holy Land had been partially accomplished.
He had saved the Crusader kingdom of Acre, guaranteed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem, and consolidated his reputation as the greatest warrior of his time. However, the journey back home would prove as dangerous and full of intrigues as the crusade itself.
Richard knew his return would not be easy. He had made powerful enemies during his journey. Philip II Augustus of France, his long-standing rival, had left the crusade earlier and was eager to take advantage of Richard's absence to expand his own power in France and England. Leopold V, Duke of Austria, held a deep resentment for having been humiliated by Richard in Acre, where his banner was removed from the city walls by order of the English king. Furthermore, many other European nobles and leaders had reasons to oppose Richard, whether due to territorial ambition, political alliances, or simple envy of his glory. The sea route, though safer than the overland route for the army, still presented dangers. Richard, with his reduced fleet and exhausted men, opted for a faster and more discreet route. He avoided the French coast, where Philip Augustus might try to capture him, and sailed through the Adriatic Sea. However, a series of storms and misfortunes forced his ship to land in hostile territory. Richard's return journey was a race against time and against his enemies. He was aware of the dangers awaiting him in Europe, but his determination to return to his kingdom and confront his rivals was unwavering. He had proven his worth in battle, but now he would have to prove his political astuteness and his ability to survive on a different battlefield, that of European intrigue. The lion was coming home, but the path was fraught with traps. Richard the Lionheart's return journey, full of dangers and disguises, culminated in his capture, an event that shocked Europe and revealed the fragility of royal power in a world of intrigues. After his forced landing on the coast of Istria in the northern Adriatic, Richard and a small group of companions tried to cross the Holy Roman Empire disguised as pilgrims. He knew he was in hostile territory, but the need to return to England was pressing. However, his fame and reputation preceded him. In December 1192, Richard was recognized in a tavern near Vienna, Austria. The man who recognized him was a servant of Duke Leopold V of Austria, the same duke Richard had humiliated in Acre by removing his banner from the city walls. Leopold, who harbored a deep resentment against Richard, saw there the perfect opportunity for his revenge. Richard was captured and imprisoned. News of his capture spread rapidly across Europe, causing a mix of shock, relief, and excitement. For his enemies, it was a golden opportunity. For his allies, it was a catastrophe. The King of England, Christendom's greatest warrior, was now in the hands of a lesser duke, a prisoner on his own continent. Richard's capture was a testament to his enemy's cunning and the vulnerability of royalty in an era of wars and intrigues. He, who had survived the dangers of the Crusade and Saladin's armies, was betrayed and imprisoned on his way home. The lion was caged, and his rivals were ready to take advantage of his absence to tear his empire apart. Richard's imprisonment was not just a personal event. It was a political blow that would destabilize England and the Angevin Empire, paving the way for years of turbulence and desperate negotiations. Richard the Lionheart's imprisonment at the hands of Leopold V of Austria was only the beginning of his ordeal. Leopold, without the legal right to imprison a king, soon handed Richard over to Emperor Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire, who held him captive in various castles, including the famous Trifles Castle. Richard's imprisonment was not for personal revenge, but for a much more pragmatic purpose: a colossal ransom. The conditions of Richard's captivity were not the most brutal, but he was isolated and under constant surveillance. He was a high-value prisoner, and his captors knew they could extract a fortune for his release. Emperor Henry VI, an ambitious and unscrupulous man, demanded a ransom that was astronomical for the time: 150,000 marks of silver, equivalent to about 100,000 pounds sterling,
a sum representing double the English crown's annual revenue. News of the demanded ransom caused panic in England. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard's mother, took the lead in efforts to raise the money. She launched an unprecedented fundraising campaign, imposing heavy taxes on land, income, and even the clergy. The English people, who loved their warrior king, contributed what they could, but the task was Herculean. The ransom was so large that it took over a year to raise.
While Richard was in captivity, his enemies in Europe tried to take advantage of his absence. Philip II Augustus of France and John, Richard's brother, conspired to divide the Angevin Empire and prevent the king's return. Philip offered money to Emperor Henry VI to keep Richard imprisoned longer, and John tried to usurp the English throne, ruling as if Richard were dead. The loyalty of some English nobles wavered, and the kingdom plunged into political turbulence. Richard, even in captivity, maintained his dignity and cunning. He composed poems, negotiated with his captors, and maintained contact with his allies in England. He knew his only hope was the payment of the ransom. His imprisonment was a period of great trial, but also of revelation, showing him the true nature of loyalty and betrayal. The price of glory and freedom was high, and Richard was paying it with every day of his captivity. The absence of Richard the Lionheart, imprisoned on the continent, plunged England and the Angevin Empire into a period of intense political turbulence. His younger brother John, the Prince John, as he would become known in the Robin Hood legend, seized the opportunity to try to usurp the throne. John, who had always been his father Henry II's favorite, was ambitious and unscrupulous. He openly conspired with Philip II Augustus of France, Richard's arch-enemy, to divide the Angevin lands and prevent the king's return. John, with the support of some discontented barons, tried to establish himself as King of England. He seized castles, collected taxes for himself, and spread rumors that Richard would never return. The loyalty of many English nobles was tested, dividing the kingdom into factions loyal to Richard and factions supporting John. England was on the verge of civil war. Philip II Augustus, in turn, was in his element. He saw Richard's imprisonment as a golden opportunity to dismantle the Angevin Empire and consolidate the power of the French crown. He invaded Richard's French possessions, besieging castles and conquering territories. He also offered money to Emperor Henry VI to keep Richard imprisoned longer, in a desperate attempt to ensure that the English king never returned.
However, the loyalty of Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard's mother, and that of his faithful administrators in England, like Justiciar William Longchamp, were crucial in keeping the kingdom united. Eleanor, with her political intelligence and determination, worked tirelessly to raise the ransom and to curb John's ambitions. She traveled throughout England, appealing to the loyalty of nobles and commoners, and managed to keep the kingdom cohesive despite conspiracies and external pressure. The political turbulence in England was a test of the kingdom's stability and the loyalty of its subjects. The absence of a strong, present king revealed the fragilities of the feudal system and the ambitions of the barons. Richard, even in captivity, was a central figure in this power struggle, and his return was the only hope of restoring order and curbing the ambitions of his enemies. After more than a year of captivity, and with the colossal ransom finally raised, Richard the Lionheart was freed. On February 4, 1194, he was released, a man who had been imprisoned by his rivals, but who emerged with his reputation as a warrior and king still intact. His liberation was a triumph of diplomacy and the loyalty of his mother and his subjects. Richard's return to England was an event of celebration and jubilation. He landed at Sandwich on March 13, 1194, and was received by an exultant crowd. The English people, who had contributed with such sacrifice for his ransom, acclaimed their warrior king. His entry into London was a spectacle of pomp and joy, with decorated streets and ringing bells.
It was a triumph, not of war, but of perseverance and loyalty. However, Richard wasted no time in reasserting his authority. He acted quickly to curb the ambitions of his brother John, who had tried to usurp the throne. John, upon learning of Richard's release, fled to France, but later surrendered and was forgiven by Richard, in an act of remarkable clemency, though with the condition that he never betray him again. Richard also acted to restore order in the kingdom, punishing the barons who had allied with John and reasserting his authority over his lands. His liberation and his return to England were a testament to the strength of his personality and his ability to inspire loyalty. He had survived captivity, his brother's betrayal, and his enemies' conspiracies. Richard the Lionheart was back, and his presence in Europe would again shift the balance of power. However, his attention would soon turn to France, where Philip II Augustus had seized many of his Angevin lands. The Lion had returned home, but the war was not yet over. After his dramatic return from captivity, Richard the Lionheart wasted no time in reasserting his authority in England and turning his attention to his arch-enemy, Philip II Augustus of France. The war between the two kings, a rivalry that had marked much of their lives, reignited with full intensity. Philip had taken advantage of Richard's absence to seize vast Angevin lands in France, and Richard was determined to reclaim them. The last 5 years of Richard's life, 1194 to 1199, were dedicated almost entirely to the war against Philip II. He spent most of this time in his French possessions, personally leading his troops in campaigns and sieges. Richard was a master of siege warfare, and his military ingenuity was evident. He built castles and fortresses, such as the impressive Château Gaillard in Normandy, a masterpiece of medieval military engineering designed to protect the heart of his continental lands. The war was brutal and costly, a series of skirmishes, sieges, and minor battles, without a decisive large-scale confrontation. Richard and Philip were astute strategists, each trying to outmaneuver the other in tactics and diplomacy. Richard, with his bravery and his presence on the battlefield, inspired his men to fight with unparalleled ferocity. He was often seen on the front line, leading charges and risking his own life, which earned him the admiration of his soldiers and the reputation of a true warrior king.
However, this dedication to war came at a cost. England, though administered by his faithful advisors, felt the absence of its king. The kingdom's resources were constantly drained to finance campaigns in France, and eternal peace and stability were often sacrificed in the name of Richard's territorial ambition. The war against Philip II was a final demonstration of Richard's military genius, but also a reminder of his impetuous nature and his prioritization of military glory over peaceful governance. In 1199, the war against Philip II Augustus continued. Richard the Lionheart was besieging the small castle of Châlus-Chabrol in Limousin, France. The castle was strategically insignificant, but there were rumors that a Roman treasure had been found there, and Richard, always needing funds for his campaigns, was determined to obtain it. During the siege, on March 26, 1199, Richard, who was inspecting the castle's defenses without armor, was struck by an arrow fired by a crossbowman from the castle, a man named Pierre Basile, or Bertrand de Gourdon, depending on the source. The arrow hit his shoulder, near the neck. The wound, though initially not appearing fatal, soon proved serious. The arrow was not removed correctly, and the wound became infected, leading to gangrene. Richard, the warrior king who had survived countless battles and a brutal crusade, succumbed to the wound. He died on April 6, 1199, at the age of 41, in Limousin, France. His death was a shock to Europe. The lion had fallen, not in a great battlefield against an enemy army, but in a minor siege, by a seemingly insignificant arrow. In his last moments, Richard showed remarkable clemency. He asked to see the crossbowman who had wounded him. When the man was brought before him, Richard forgave him, ordering him to be set free and given 100 shillings. However, after Richard's death, the captain of his mercenaries, Mercader, disobeyed the king's order and brutally executed the crossbowman. The death of Richard the Lionheart was an unexpected end for a king who had lived such a grand and turbulent life. His heart was buried in Rouen, his entrails in Charroux, and the rest of his body next to his father, Henry II, in Fontevraud Abbey.
Richard the Lionheart's death marked the end of his life, but it was only the beginning of his immortality. His figure, already legendary in life, would transform into a myth that would echo for centuries, shaping the image of the warrior king and the ideal knight. For England, Richard became a symbol of bravery, honor, and military glory. Although he spent little time in his kingdom, his reputation as the Lionheart, a nickname he probably received during his lifetime for his ferocity and courage in battle, solidified in popular memory. He was the idealized king, the perfect knight, Christendom's champion who dared to face the great Saladin. This image, often romanticized, obscured more complex aspects of his reign, such as his prolonged absence and the heavy taxes he imposed. In literature and popular culture, Richard the Lionheart became a recurring character. He is a central figure in the legends of Robin Hood, portrayed as the just king who returns to restore order and justice in a kingdom oppressed by his brother John. This representation, although fictional, helped cement his image as a popular hero. He inspired countless works of fiction, films, and games, perpetuating his myth as the perfect knight. For the Muslim world, Richard was a formidable enemy, but also a respected leader. Saladin, his great rival, admired him for his courage and military skill. This relationship of mutual respect between two legendary adversaries is one of the most fascinating aspects of his legacy, showing that honor could transcend the boundaries of faith and war. Richard the Lionheart's legacy is therefore a complex tapestry of facts and legends. He was a warrior king, a crusader, a brilliant strategist, and a man of intense passions. His life was an incessant pursuit of glory and recognition, and his name became synonymous with bravery and an indomitable heart. He may not have been the most present king for England, but he was, without a doubt, one of the most memorable, a true lion on the battlefield of history.
Richard the Lionheart, a king who lived and died by the sword, whose life was a saga of war, faith, and glory. He personified the ideal of the medieval knight, a leader who inspired loyalty and terror in equal measure. His story reminds us of the complexity of leadership, the price of ambition, and the enduring power of myth. He was one of the last great Crusader kings, and his life marked the end of an era of religious fervor and great expeditions to the Holy Land.